Good morning, everyone. I'm delighted to be here to be introducing the four panelists for our first discussion. We're going to be starting with Dr. Michael Jarvis, who is an associate professor at the University of Rochester, where he teaches early American, maritime, Atlantic, and digital history. Since 1990, he has studied Bermuda's early history and its relations to the wider Atlantic world. He wrote the first book in the Bermuda National Trust Historical Buildings series, which was focused on St. George's property, and more recently, the award-winning In the Eye of Old Trade, which is about Bermuda's early history. He has done archaeological digs at Smith Island in Bermuda, and also works with the University of Ghana to digitally record and research Gold Coast slave trade castles and forts. So he will be our first speaker. He will be followed by Bermuda's own Dr. Clarence Maxwell. Dr. Clarence Maxwell is assistant professor for Caribbean and Latin American history at Millersville University in Pennsylvania. It's a nice farming area there. He was formerly registrar and director of historical research at the Bermuda Maritime Museum and is currently co-editor of the academic journal of the National Museum of Bermuda. He has written extensively about slavery and the African diaspora, and he is in demand locally as a lecturer and writer. He authored the Bermuda National Trust book about historical buildings in Pembroke, and he is co-author of a soon-to-be-published book about Bermuda's role in the Age of Revolution. Now, I think our next speaker is actually going to be the Honorable Walton Brown, who is Minister for the Cabinet Office and former Minister of Home Affairs. But before that, he had a distinguished career here at the Bermuda College, where he was a lecturer in politics and history. His book, Bermuda and the Struggle for Reform, Race, Politics, and Ideology, 1944 to 1998, won the 2013 Bermuda Literary Award for Nonfiction. Our final speaker will be Ajala Omodele. He's a freelance writer, literary specialist, and educator. He has written books about Dame Lois Brown Evans, Paulu Caramafagego, and Marcus Garvey. His book entitled A Tale of Two Women, Sally Bassett, Mary Prince, and the True Story of Slavery in Bermuda is near completion. And he is also working on a book of poetry and a work of fiction aimed at young readers. So I present to you the panel, and I think we're going to start with Dr. Jarvis first.
Thank you. 220 years, 10 minutes, one slide, here goes. I'm a historian of the Atlantic world and very much appreciate that slavery and race relations change across time and space. I primarily look at French, Dutch, Spanish, and English, British expansions into the Americas, and very much appreciate that. That if we want to talk about slavery and resistance and race relations, it's very much rooted in change over time, and especially the work that formed the bedrock and shaped the colonies, the environment. So Bermuda is no different. I would say roughly that we have three different Bermudas during this period. And to understand the three different Bermudas is to understand three different blending forms of slavery, and then the resistance that would come to that slavery change across time. So, for the first 70 years of Bermuda, early Bermuda, this was an agricultural colony, started initially exclusively on tobacco, a cash crop, grown on shares in small 25-acre units across the island. But over time, the price of tobacco collapsed. the island shifted into diverse agriculture and also crafts and manufacturing, which were exported. This was when Bermuda made things and exported it. England also, we have three different British empires, if you will. In the 17th century, the colonies that Britain created were largely independent and uncoordinated. We have incredible change in England itself. We have a civil war. We chop one king's head off. We get rid of another king. There really isn't an empire, or it is forming in these years. And the important intellectual context is subject rights. People living in English colonies in the Caribbean, in Virginia, in New England, in Bermuda, they have subject rights. And subject rights can be stripped away. So the slave codes we see being created by largely independent governments and colonies, this is the slave code. We strip away the rights of of African people, people of African descent in the individual colonies. They have the rights equal to whites by default, and these are eroded by individual colonies to create the racism and the unfair discrimination within slavery. And England itself at home is very much in mess and very little oversight of this. So in some ways, slavery is deliberately created differently in different English colonies, but largely unchecked. Bermuda is a triracial society. Native Americans are brought in on the same ship as the first African in 1616, and Native Americans are brought in throughout the 17th century as well. Perhaps 10% of Bermuda's population is of African or African descent in the 1620s, rising to about 33% by the end of this. Drawn from Angola, we can document, and largely privateers are bringing them in from Spanish Caribbean locations. So the Iberian world, the Iberian tradition and system of slavery is very much relevant to understanding Bermuda's early period too. Resistance is difficult. Proportionally, whites are very much the majority, and enslaved peoples are in white households very much dominated. There's a Puritan religious surveillance system also in this era. So resistance is difficult, small size of island, very little trade, very little opportunities to run away, but it is practiced on a daily level in terms of resisting every day the work that is put upon them. And there are several revolt plots that are detected, and even some that result in violence, attacking the owners or masters of these people. Fast forwarding forward, 1690s, the Bermuda Company is abolished. Bermuda shifts into a maritime period of shipbuilding, of using those ships to trade, carry freight elsewhere, wrecking, privateering. This is an age where male and female experiences become radically different. Men might travel 5,000 miles in a year. Women in Bermuda, be they black or white, are living their entire lives without moving 20 miles from where they were born. So the male economy is highly diverse and highly sort of certainly Atlantic-wide, whereas female work remains much more like the 17th century system. England, the British colony, the British Empire is changing at this time. 1690s, we only start to kind of knit together and crystallize an empire and try to standardize things across time. We shift, thanks to John Locke and other philosophers, into a different situation. He argues that natural rights, people live in a state of nature, and they come together and they create a government. So natural rights predate and overarch subject rights. And this becomes the chinks in creating and sustaining intellectually, politically a slave system start to fall into place, start to crystallize at this time. Bermuda in this maritime period becomes a biracial society. Indian as an indicator drops away in historic records in the 18th century. And basically you have sort of white and non-white as binary categories, and laws are created and practices are created by which essentially you are either white and you are therefore free, or you are not white and therefore de facto a slave. There are laws whereby if you become free and you are not white, you have to leave the island. Bittersweet, transforming, personal liberty and emancipation into exile from the country you were born, because almost all Bermudians, either white or black, are native born by this time. Self-replicating populations, very few immigrants coming to the island. It's a very full, very crowded island. Resistance, I find, particularly takes the form of what I would say profit sharing, and white masters would call theft. In that you are appropriating the fruits of your labor, the things that you are making. You might be seen as stealing them, but in fact you have created this, slaves at the time have created this. And I turn to my archaeology. Historically, document-wise, it's very difficult to get at the lived experiences of 18th century enslaved Bermudians. So archaeology becomes an alternate way. And on Smith's Island, we have a cave site deliberately sculpted. And we find butchered cow and pig bones. We find some rather expensive pottery, English pottery, imported pottery in the ground there. And this very much seems to be a social place where I would say enslaved Bermudians met together to socialize, to talk, to feast on the very bones that we have found. Maritime marinage, black enslaved sailors could run away in foreign ports. And in some cases, even women could get on ships and escape to other colonies, hopefully to better lives, but not always. Through the large traffic of Bermuda's fleet. There's also the 1731 and 1762 slave plots, Sarah Bassett, and in 1762, about which Professor Maxwell has written extensively. And then the third period, do I have much time left? Okay, a little bit. In the 1780s, as a result of the American Revolution, the empire has changed. The Atlantic world has changed. Bermuda's economy is very much thrown into disruption and plunged into chaos and economic hardship, in that the old maritime economy really collapses. Freight rates drop. Bermudians cannot compete. Various areas of trade are shut from them. And this is the era in the 1780s and 90s where we get the creation of the plantations of the Turks Islands. And I call it a plantation because we think of plantation labor as being time-oriented, entirely coerced, entirely unpaid and uncompensated, brutal work, unskilled work. This is the world that Mary Prince so tragically describes for us. And this is sort of arriving at this period in the 1780s and 90s as many of the traditional Bermudian economic activities collapse and this new alternative becomes developed and put into place. We go from a seasonal to a year-round and multi-year element to this. The British military comes and garrisons the island as a strategic stronghold. All of these forts that Professor Harris loves to write about. Many of these are products of this time. So British military spending and employment in the various dockyards and catering to garrison needs becomes really in the early 19th century the bedrock of Bermuda's economy. We get, after the loss of 13 of the 26 colonies in America, we get now really a shift to India, a shift to a global empire in the British case. The French Revolution changes the conversation to talk about human rights. Human rights, liberté, fraternité, égalité, and these are not connected to a particular people in a natural world, but basically, these are rights of everybody, regardless of ethnicity or color, and slavery becomes essentially intellectually unsustainable, unjustifiable when we shift to a rhetoric of natural rights. And my time is up, and the last bit will be addressed, I think, very skillfully by the rest of the panel.
I'll just add that there will be a question and answer session at the end after everyone has presented. So our next speaker is Dr. Maxwell.
Good morning. I'd like to tell a story. I've told this story many times before, so bear with me if you've heard it, and forgive me. But I want to mention it primarily because I believe these individuals, including to some extent Mary Prince, were the architects of the world that would develop after 1834. These individuals, 38 individuals, will be the ones who I'll talk about. So I'll begin with them. On the 13th of January, 1834, in Bermuda, a group of free-colored and free black men, as they were called, met to put together a petition. And the petition basically stated this, that it was called the Petition for the Further Amelioration of Their Condition. What was happening at the moment was that there was a beginning to start the debate over the emancipation of slavery that began in 1833. The British had sent a bill for all the colonies to amend, as it was their practice, and they were about to construct this new system, abolition society, that was going to happen post-1834. These men suddenly got concerned about this because they feared, understandably, that what they'll get was something that was going to look a whole lot like what they had before. So they decided to meet and put together a petition. They were a strange array of people. They included a planter, they included a branch pilot, they included a clerk, and they also included one of the wealthiest black men in Bermuda, a shipbuilder by the name of James Attle. By the time this bill came, their purpose was to ensure that Bermuda's legislation would in fact reflect their concerns, and particularly would deal with the problem of civil disabilities that were systematically placed on the basis of race. My purpose here is to set the context and the character for this particular style of activism. The context in which there was a demographic revolution that occurred in Bermuda roughly around the same time, but also to place this in the larger international context for which this occurred. We have to, what is never given or never seen as part of the context has been the, some writers have called the humanitarian revolution. And I would like to show and discuss this event and its application to Bermuda. Let me explain, first of all, what I mean by the humanitarian revolution. How am I doing? Am I good? Thank you. The great historian Franklin Wright once noted that the American Revolution was a struggle for civil and political rights. But then he said, and this is significant, what would occur in the Caribbean, that would occur in what we call Saint-Domingue. I will call it Saint-Domingue until it becomes Haiti in 1804. What happened in those was that we moved from the conflict for civil rights to the conflict for human rights, as Dr. Jarvis had mentioned. And that was the fundamental shift that would occur as a result of the struggle that was occurring in the Caribbean, as well as in Latin America, which would be pushed forward by people like Miguel Hidalgo in Mexico and Simón Bolívar in Venezuela. The human rights struggle would therefore have two components that the great historian and what's the word I'm looking for? Hero, there we go. The great Edward Braithwaite once called the humanitarian revolution, and in which he said he called it the struggle for the international Atlantic struggle for the abolition of slavery, the push by blacks, particularly for religious education, because they believe, and they've been believing this from the 1600s, that education was the tool for their emancipation, and most important, the push to removal of civil disabilities based on race. That's the addition that is. The two I'm going to focus on will be the push for abolition and the push against civil disabilities based on race. As I said, the inspiration for this was occurring in a place we never would expect it, and that is the French Revolution in Saint-Domingue, the slave uprising, which I believe is distinctly different from what would be called the Haitian Revolution that would begin in 1803 and 1804. Why do I mention these? Because all these things set forth two most important elements. One, the push for civil liberties. By the time that revolution was finished, it had constructed a regime in which civil liberties would be spread throughout the French Empire. Slavery ended in 1794, partly because of the insurgency carried out by blacks in Saint-Domingue. Let me repeat that point. Partly because of the insurgency that blacks carried out in the island of Saint Domingue. That was their condition. We will support the revolution if and only if there is a movement toward the abolition of slavery and the increasing of civil rights. Fast forward, what does that have to do, you're probably saying, with Bermuda? Because they were watching this. How do we know this? The record says it. Henry Hamilton complained that the blacks were constantly in contact with people in the Caribbean and were in the islands in resistance. Andrew Durnford complained that there was a manifest behavioral change among black people in Bermuda. Bridget Goodrich complained along with them with the same petition, saying that there was a manifest change in their behavior. Why? Because they were reading the same newspapers that everybody else was reading. And those newspapers were filled with stories of Toussaint Louverture blasting his way across Saint Domingue, as well as other events. Demographic events occurring at the same time. In 1806, we see the end. For the first time, for most of Bermuda's history, as Dr. Jarvis has mentioned, Bermuda was in fact dominated. It was a white numerical domination. And my other mentor, Elaine Foreman Crane, makes the point, it was a female majority domination. By 1806, that changed. From 1806, it went from a white numerical domination to a black numerical domination. And that was both seen as well as, was quantified as well as seen. Just a small point, the white population was 4,798. In 1806, the black population became 5,240. It had dwarfed it, not dwarfed it, it surpassed it by 542 people. By the time they're talking about abolition, the black population was 4,898. The white population was 4,297. That's the context for discussing the abolition of slavery. Because it became very, very clear from that point forward that it was going to be now a society in which blacks were numerically dominant. What I like to call the white area of Arthur had come to an end in 1806 in terms of numerical domination. And more to the point, the free black population had now reached 7% and was going to reach 12% by 1833. That led to the political activism, which I'll summarize in two sets. That was petitionism, to which the narrative of Mary Prince must be seen. It was, in fact, a very large petition against slavery. She became herself a free black, and therefore that was her petition. And of course, the petition I mentioned by these 38 black men. Both of them, one ended slavery, became part of the discourse for the ending of slavery. The other became part of the discourse for the ending of abolition. What did they ask for? They asked simply for the removal of civil disabilities based on race. What did they get? Abolition Act 1 and Abolition Act 2. Abolition Act 1 would end slavery, as Mary Prince so eloquently put it up, till slavery would be done up forevermore. But Abolition Act 2 would be for the first time establishing and putting into place systems that eradicated race-based systems of segregation. So, well, you're probably asking, Bermuda still became segregated. What happened? It moved from the public sphere, from the public square to the private sphere. From this point forward, racism would be privatized. Understand the condition of that, because what that would mean that education, which should have been a public system, would have to become private in order for it to be segregated. That meant large numbers of people would not be able to have access to it because they'll have to pay for it. At a time when movements around the world were moving toward much later, moving toward public education available to all. Also, last but not least, I'll make this last point. There was black activism took on a different role. Instead, it would become one in which they would bring in allies in support for their cause. And that would become the methodology that would dominate from the rest of the period. As I said, what they got from it was quite simple. To a large extent, the men got what they wanted. Mary Prince certainly got what she wanted. Slavery was done up forevermore, she eloquently stated. I know what a slave is. I know how a slave feels. And I want all people in England to know it too, so they break our chains and set us free. That was her statement. I memorized it. But for the most part, of course, this group of men excluded women. That's another thing that. And therefore, the issue of female suffrage never showed up in what they got. What they got, However, but having said that, and I'll conclude on this point, what they got was a post-abolition society according to the petition that they had asked for. They are, in many ways, they're both of them, Mary Prince on one side, these 38 men on the other, are the architects of the post-abolition society as well. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Maxwell. And Mr. Brown, you can have the microphone next.
Thank you, and good morning, everyone. I'm going to talk about the process which led to abolition and some of the consequences of abolition. But before I begin, I want to talk a little bit about paternalism. Paternalism is the nexus that defines the relationship between slave and slave master. Paternalism is a system of oppression that led to serious consequences for the black population in Bermuda. By paternalism, I refer to a system of oppression in which there was a one-to-one relationship between the slave and slave master. Bermuda, unlike many other Caribbean territories, did not have a plantation system. So you did not have this system of large numbers working collectively together in opposition to the elites. You had a series of small interactions on the ships and in the home. So you had a one-on-one relationship. That led to what I call a collective weakness within the black community, a collective weakness vis-a-vis the white elite, the dominant group. You saw that reflected in the fact that for many of the planned slave escapes, there was always someone who informed the slave master of what was being planned. That's indicative of a collective weakness within the black community. So there was resistance, but there was weakness nevertheless. This collective weakness found its way into the system, and it permeated the system. By the time you get to abolition, you saw a very interesting system develop. You saw the government pass legislation to diminish the black political representation. The voting qualification was increased from 40 pounds to 100 pounds to vote, and the qualification for those who wanted to run for office increased from having a property valued at 100 pounds to a value of 400 pounds. It's a very significant increase in the voting rights. That led to a diminution of power within the black community. That was reflective of the changes that took place. At the same time, you had a system whereby the white minority, non-white minority, as others have spoken to, attempted to diminish the black population. You saw letters to the editor saying to the black community, oh, you should leave, you can find a better opportunity in Africa or elsewhere, and they were encouraging people to leave the island. That was a symptom of the white elite attempting to diminish the black population. There was also an effort made in 1842 to pass a law entitled an act to encourage the white people to come to Bermuda from England. So the very clear manifestation of the racialized policies. These racialized policies continued in existence right up until, well, the 1960s and 70s, because you saw the efforts in the 1920s, early 20th century and 1920, where they brought in West Indian workers to work the dry docks up in Dockyard. And whenever they brought in someone, they would always say that they wanted them to leave, whereas the whites who came in, they would encourage them to stay. So there's a very clear racial bias to the immigration policy, which is long-standing, and that's a significant factor of Bermuda's experience. We saw this reflected in the 1920s and 30s, and it goes right up into the 1950s. I know I'm getting ahead of myself, but the 1950s was a period of great transformation in regard to immigration policy. You saw the 1950s and 60s, a great change. In the 1950s, you had a net migrant population of about 700 people coming to the island. 1960s to 1970, you had net growth of 8,000 people. And most of these people were able to vote after being here for 3 years, because we changed the legislation to allow anyone who had lived on the island, who was a British Commonwealth citizen, the right to vote after 3 years of residence. And so there was a clear policy to orchestrate immigration policy for political purposes right up until that time. And that's the reality that we had to face. It was a very clear, cold reality. But immigration policy has been a symptom of the racialized policies of Bermuda. That's what we witnessed in our period of time. That was the reality of it, and that's what we had to deal with. The racialized policies continued to permeate the island, and it led to some resistance. But in the 1830s, there was no resistance, and that was a reflection of the collective weakness in the black community. When the law was changed to grant blacks reduced voting rights and power, there was very little resistance to it, and that was suggestive of a weakness in the black community. Thank you. I have 5 minutes left. Yes. The issue of immigration is a significant one. In the 1920s, you saw the population shifting toward bringing in West Indian workers. And that created a set of challenges. That led to attempts to marshal the black population into discontent within the black community. You saw attempts to divide the black population among the West Indian population. There were reports in the House of Assembly where they talked about the good workers being black Bermudian workers, the bad workers being the West Indian workers. So there was clear attempts to divide and conquer the population. That was an effort made that was almost successful because they helped to create divisions within the black population. The West Indian population were a population that was much more resistant to the status quo. They challenged the elites much more so. Those who worked at the dry docks, and they were always those who were more actively involved in civil disobedience. That was in contrast to the more placid nature of the black Bermudian population. And so that led to a series of challenges. So that's what we have before us. Okay. Thank you very much. Okay.
Thank you, Mr. Brown. And now we will have our final speaker, Mr. Umadali.
So I have 10 minutes, right? 10 minutes straight? I didn't get some overflow from
You can get some.
Dr. Brown? Okay.
You don't want to stand up?
I may not. I don't know yet. Hello all. Glad you came. Adult ADHD demands that I ask everybody to stand up if you're able to stand. If you're not, just raise your hand. But we need to, it's been pretty intense.
Body break.
Yeah, just breathe a bit. Yeah. White people, sit down. White people, sit down. Black folk, I'm talking to you here. This story that I'm sharing, these excerpts, yes? Oh. These excerpts that I'm going to read are the story of your blood and bone. Yes? The stories that I'm about to share come from your lineage. So I want you in particular to pay attention to what is shared. I know I only have 10 minutes, well, probably 9 and a bit, but take it in viscerally, especially if you're black and female, because I'm sharing stories drawn from the lives of Sally Bassett and Mary Prince, two of our great martyred revolutionaries, some of whose descendants are more than likely among those standing here. I'm talking about your family. So everybody clear about that? Okay, take a seat. Okay, this is this mic on?
Yeah.
It is? Okay. I'm drawing a couple of excerpts from my upcoming book entitled A Tale of Two Women, Sally Bassett, Mary Prince, and the true story of slavery in Bermuda. Because history. Hello? Yeah? It's good? Okay. Because who gets to tell the story is the story of Bermuda is contested ground. Right? For so long, there have been writers and historians, or at least they wear the guise of writers and historians, who have spun a very specific story of slavery in Bermuda, which I feel is an affront to my ancestors. Right? And part of my, my moral obligation is to bring those ancestors' stories into the room. Right? So this is what I'm to share here. This is from the chapter simply called Kill Them All. Wherever whites imposed chattel slavery upon Africans, fierce resistance inevitably followed. Bermuda, a tiny subtropical backwater more than 600 miles east of the Carolinas, was not exempt from this trend. Some local and foreign historians have claimed that the relationship between the enslaved Bermudian and the Bermudian enslaver was comparatively amicable. They argued that the absence of the plantation system, combined with the fact that blacks and whites lived and worked closely together, somehow fostered a refreshingly collegial atmosphere that magically dissolved any enmity between the owners and their shackled property. These historians repeatedly opined that relations between the races in Bermuda were so much better than in other, less enlightened locales. If we take their statements to be true, it would logically follow that such a tranquil and harmonious social climate would likely not trigger the viral spread of righteous bloodlust among the enslaved. So why then would the island's blacks plan to embark upon a premeditated orgy of mass murder with the intention of slaying their white compatriots down to the last man, woman, and child? Put another way, how do we reconcile the image of the happy black slave and the gentle white master with the jarring reality of the conspiracy of 1761? In that year, more than half of the island's enslaved black population conspired to murder their way out of bondage by killing all of the white people, an action that would simultaneously abolish slavery in Bermuda and allow them to assume total control of the island. Now, this was 30 years before Haiti was liberated. So that's before they started the revolution that would lead to their emancipation and the abolition of slavery in 1804 in Haiti. The scope of the conspiracy reflected a great deal of planning. Firstly, poisoners would be enlisted to lace their owners' food and dwellings with poisons that would bring about their death. This initial strike would be followed by the systematic killing of owners and their children in their beds, along with the murder of those blacks who were adjudged to be on the side of the whites. By the end of the bloodshed, all of Bermuda's nearly 5,000 whites would be dead, and the 4,000 or so enslaved Africans would be free, the unquestioned masters of the realm. On the evening of the 12th of October, however, a secret discussion related to the uprising was overheard by a white seaman named John Vickers, who alerted others of the grave threat to white life posed by the plotting of the conspirators. Vickers' raising of the alarm the following morning set in motion a series of events that the whites desperately hoped would keep them out of harm's way. Martial law was declared, and each parish was required by law to assign teams of watchmen to monitor free and enslaved blacks. Legislation was also passed to further constrain the movement of the island's blacks and to facilitate the expulsion of free blacks from Bermuda. Of particular note, and I think this is very important, of particular note is that whether enslaved or free, Black Bermuda held its collective tongue. They refused to divulge any details of the conspiracy and its principal architects, in spite of repeated offers of manumission and financial reward. And it is because of their willingness to remain silent that although the actual number of conspirators was surely greater, only 6 people, 5 men and 1 woman, were eventually found guilty, lynched, and burned. Yeah. Now we're going to jump to Mary Prince's story, and I'm going to try to run through this quickly. How am I doing for time? What? Golly. Okay. Both Captain, this is called She Stripped Me and Flogged Me, / He Beat Me Till I Was Unable to Stand. This is in benign, peaceful Bermuda, where slaves and slave masters were just happy all the time. Both Captain Ingham and his wife, who was also named Mary, reveled in the violence that they inflicted upon the enslaved people in their charge. In the Ingham household, neither age nor sex could exempt the victims from their cruelty. Mary witnessed many instances where the captain's wife terrorized Jack and Cyrus, two little enslaved boys. Whenever she felt so inclined, she pinched them, peppered them with hard blows, and beat them until the whip lacerated their flesh. Mrs. Ingham's penchant for sexual sadism, a perverse interest shared by her husband, revealed itself in the habit of torturing young Mary by stripping her naked, suspending her by her wrists, and savagely whipping her. Indeed, Mary's descriptions of Miss Ingham's many acts of savagery put to rest the unfounded belief that white women were not actively and enthusiastically engaged in carrying out the physical and sexual violence suffered by the enslaved. Captain Ingham proved himself to be his wife's equal in terms of his capacity to abuse the vulnerable. Mary describes in graphic detail the beating that he gave to the pregnant Hetty, during which he had to stop several times because the force and frequency with which he swung the whip and brought it down upon Hetty's naked body left him all but spent. So severe was the beating that Hetty went into premature labor, ultimately giving birth to a stillborn baby whom she was not permitted to mourn. With her body bloated by infection and her heart heavy with the catastrophic loss of her child, Hetty soon succumbed to her wounds. Mary herself almost met the same fate after Mrs. Ingham blamed her for breaking a clay jar that was, in fact, already badly cracked. For this crime, she whipped Mary unmercifully, only abandoning the assault when fatigue overtook her. Mr. Ingham, upon hearing Mary's offense, promised to beat her the next day. And true to his word, at noon the following day, he whipped Mary until he was exhausted. He would likely have beaten her to death after catching a second wind, were it not for the providential intervention of an earthquake. In the resulting chaos, Mary was able to crawl under the steps of the veranda, where she remained, clinging to life until morning. Now, in light of the time, I wanted to make clear the fact that slavery was not benign. Never was it benign. When your humanity is ripped from you as a precondition for the establishment of what we know as Western civilization, when your immutable humanity is the foundation upon which white wealth has been built, you cannot begin a conversation talking about the suffering of my ancestors, because I feel this very viscerally. Understand this, I feel this very viscerally, as something that wasn't as bad as in the United States because they had plantation slavery. We are doing a disservice. In fact, we are doing a violence to our ancestors when we speak of their suffering as anything other than hellish. I think that's a very important point to make, because Bermudian historians and writers, both Bermudian and foreign, have this habit of, and I'll just give you an example, of minimizing our suffering. This is by James E. Smith, writing in Slavery in Bermuda. He states that enslaved black Bermudians were treated more humanely than those in the Caribbean, and that Bermudian enslavement encouraged a degree of intimacy and personal contact between master and slave. I think Mary Prince would beg to differ. I'm fairly certain that Sally Bassett would as well. I'm absolutely positively sure that if they could speak, the heads that were affixed to the spikes along Gibbet Island would issue a dissenting opinion.
Thank you.
Dan?
Oh,